Hi, my name is Sophia. They call me Mrs. Lysander now, the woman who rebuilt herself, the philanthropist with the practiced smile, the wife of a man the world calls a titan. But that's not where my story begins. Before the wealth, before the headlines, there was a girl he pulled into his gilded cage, a furious artist drowning in debt, a nobody people used and discarded, a girl who signed the wrong contract and ended up belonging to the wrong man. No one knew what he truly was to me. No one thought I'd survive him. And I never imagined I'd fall in love with the man who controlled my every breath. So sit down. Get comfortable. This isn't a fairy tale. It's the truth. How I traded my freedom for a king. And how we somehow fell in love only after we broke each other first. This story isn't short. It can't be, not with everything we survived and everything we destroyed on our way to loving each other. So I'm giving it to you in parts, piece by piece, truth by truth. And this is the third part. Here you go. Ivana's fingers released my arm as if I'd become electrified. She stumbled back a step, her eyes wide, but the panic in them was no longer self-serving. It was comprehension. Adrian was playing a different game, with one that made her, the rival, completely irrelevant. I stared down at the phone, at the message Adrian had sent specifically to my device, in the middle of a massive security breach aimed at Lysander. It wasn't about destroying his business or even killing him outright. It was psychological warfare designed to expose his vulnerability, his love for me, and use it as the weapon. The knowledge hit me not with fear, but with a searing, defiant heat. I shoved the phone into my back pocket and squared my shoulders. Adrian wanted me scared? He wanted Lysander distracted by my safety? No. I wouldn't let my feelings or his twisted definition of them be the crack in the armor. My breathing deepened, forcing the frantic edge out of my lungs. I was no longer the outsider. I was now an active target, and that gave me a purpose. I looked at the sealed iron door where Lysander had vanished and knew exactly what I had to do. Not hide, but fight. I would not be the weakness he exploited. I would be the defense he hadn't planned for. I pushed past Ivana, turning my back on her wide, frightened eyes, and started jogging toward the massive, sealed bronze door that led to the central stairwell. But the mansion itself started to betray us. The repetitive, high-pitched whoop of the siren suddenly stuttered, cutting off mid-cycle, leaving a ringing silence that was instantly more terrifying than the noise. The rows of overhead recessed lighting along the hall flickered, not quickly, but with a slow, sickly dimming, and then a snap back to full light. The sound of the HVAC system, usually a gentle hum, began to rattle, a dry metallic shudder. Ivana gasped, clutching her hands to her mouth, staring at a keypad on the wall near a service entrance. The little green light that signaled locked, blinked, hesitated, and then pulsed red, green, like a dying heart. Adrian wasn't just outside the gates. He was inside the circuitry, dismantling the house from the inside out. This wasn't protection anymore. This was a siege, and the walls were turning against us. A heavy suction pulled the air tight in the hall, followed by a low, deafening whumph that vibrated deep in my chest and made my jaw lock. Before the echo could die, every light source, the recessed LEDs, the elegant wall sconces, even the frantic red emergency strobes, snapped into absolute consuming darkness. Ivana's sound was a starved, ragged shriek, a spike of pure, unprotected panic that shattered the total vacuum of light. Then a new sound began, a deep, slow, intentional clunk-clunk. It wasn't frantic alarm noise. It resonated up from the bedrock, traveling through the marble floor and vibrating in the bones of my feet, the sound of colossal luck, hidden machinery grinding into life deep in the mansion's subterranean foundations. It felt less like a defense mechanism and more like a final, irreversible sequence had been initiated. It wasn't just a break-in. It was a hostile takeover. The house had stopped being a shield and started to become a weapon, and we were trapped inside its operational core. I didn't realize how loud the mechanical clunking of the house's core had been until it finally faded, replaced by the profound, absolute silence of the power outage. Ivana was still breathing ragged, hysterical breaths somewhere behind me, but I didn't wait. My goal was the stairwell, and the stairwell was dark. I felt my way along the smooth wallpaper, my fingers splayed, the marble floor unnervingly cool beneath my bare feet. The red glow from the outside security lights, now functioning on emergency backup, cast faint, anxious shadows. When I finally made it to the junction outside my suite, I paused, leaning my forehead against the cold wall to catch my breath. I was focusing on the faint, far-off shouts of the security team when I heard it. Not a shout, not a groan, but a whisper of movement. The soft, almost imperceptible creak of an old floorboard giving way under weight just inside the doorway to my darkened bedroom. My heart hammered against my ribs, a sudden, frantic drumming that drowned out the blood rushing in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to tell myself it was the house settling or Ivana stumbling, but the breath I held tasted like ash, tight and metallic. That sound wasn't the house turning against us. That sound was someone else. That sound was inside. I pushed off the wall and forced myself toward the black square of my doorway. Every muscle was locked, silent, a rigid coil of resistance against the terror trying to bloom in my chest. I didn't reach for a light switch. They were dead anyway. I just eased myself over the threshold into the oppressive darkness of my suite. The emergency light filtering from the hallway was useless. It only illuminated the immediate polished floor and the lower edge of the bed. It took me a full 3 seconds to process why the room felt wrong, why the shadows seemed deeper and sharper than they should be. It wasn't about what was missing. It was about what was exposed. The antique mahogany jewelry box Lysander had given me, always kept tucked inside the wardrobe, was sitting open on the glass dresser top. The velvet lining was disturbed, the few cheap trinkets I owned scattered and glinting faintly in the weak light. Across the room, the heavy marble bookends had been moved, and the small stack of notebooks I used for my own research, the ones Lysander insisted I keep locked away, were not only displaced, but the top one was lying face down on the rug, a single corner of the page dog-eared. It was the page where I'd written out my family's financial history. My breath stopped, locked tight behind my ribs. The physical shock was instant and complete. I didn't scream or run. I simply froze, a statue of pure dread, staring at that small, deliberate crease in the paper. This wasn't a robbery or random chaos. This was an intimate, calculated violation. Whoever had been in here hadn't just looked. They had taken their time, read my secrets, and left a small, cold signature to ensure I knew I was now fully and intimately exposed. The intruder was gone, but the certainty that they had been standing right here, touching my things, made the skin crawl on my neck. The sheer, brutal violation of the dog-eared page broke the paralysis. The defiance I'd felt minutes ago in the hall, that fierce resolve to be strong, crumpled into a terrifying need for safety, for his presence. It didn't matter that we were fighting. In the face of this invasive, calculating fear, I instinctively reached for the only shield I had left. I stumbled backward, spinning out of the bedroom and back into the dark hallway, reaching for the dead wall phone panel. Lysander! It wasn't a tactical alert or a controlled signal. It was a single, primal cry ripped from my throat, raw and breaking, the sound of a small, cornered animal. The word shattered the silence, echoing down the high, vaulted corridor and getting lost in the distance. I held my breath, listening for the familiar, short bark of a command, the heavy, fast footsteps of a guard, anything. Nothing. Just the faint, mechanical groan of the house's subterranean machinery and the distant, muffled sound of voices that were too far away, too preoccupied with the perimeter to hear the small, personal danger that had just invaded my life. The emptiness of the reply felt like an answer. He was locked away, unavailable, defending his perimeter while his center, me, was being dismantled. The isolation hit me, cold and absolute, and the fear sharpened into pure, desperate panic. I whirled back into the bedroom, eyes straining in the deep shadow, grabbing the nearest lamp base, a heavy, useless piece of bronze, ready to throw it. But the only movement was near the floor. Milo, curled up on the rug near the foot of the bed, wasn't rushing toward me like he always did when he heard my voice. He wasn't even barking at the open, ransacked room. He was struggling, a soft, continuous whining sound, too high-pitched to be a normal whimper, scraped out of his throat. He tried to stand, his front paws scrambling on the slick rug, but his back legs seemed to drag, useless and heavy. Milo? I dropped the lamp, the bronze clanging harmlessly on the carpet. I scrambled toward him on my knees, the cold marble pressing into my bare skin. He tilted his head toward me, his big brown eyes dull and confused, and then he let out a choked sound, a quick, rattling exhale. He tried to wag his tail, a tiny, weak flutter, before his whole body lurched sideways, his head bumping the rug hard. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't being strange. He was paralyzed. My focus snapped entirely off Lysander, off the threat to the house, off the notes Adrian had read. The danger wasn't intellectual or political anymore. It was small, breathing, and completely dependent on me, and it was dying. A dizzying wave of pure, raw dread washed over me, a physical sickness twisting my stomach. I reached for Milo, my fingers tangling in his thick fur, searching frantically for a wound, anything external. But his skin felt warm and normal. He was just heavy, inert, a dead weight in my arms. As I lifted him slightly, turning him to check his stomach, the movement shifted the air around us. That's when I smelled it. It wasn't the fresh ozone of the storm outside, nor the dust of the old house. It was a faint, sharp scent, almost medicinal, buried beneath the lingering vanilla and fear that clung to Ivana. It was a smell I recognized from the cleaning cart the staff used, a chemical solvent, but stronger, more acrid. My gaze swept the area near the door, now just a pool of shadow in the total darkness. I didn't see footprints on the dark wood, but the deep pile of the antique Persian rug just inside the door threshold looked subtly wrong. The fibers, usually uniform, were slightly flattened and slightly damp, as if someone had just wiped their feet there, or maybe dragged something heavy out. The realization hit me like a physical punch. They hadn't poisoned him directly. The intruder had used some kind of agent, maybe a powerful sedative, on the floor itself, and Milo, who always slept right by the door, protecting me, had inhaled it or absorbed it through his paws. This wasn't a warning, Adrian. This was an attempt to neutralize my only small, furry shield. My panic evaporated, replaced by a searing clarity. The threat was not just psychological. It was intimate, deliberate, and happening right now. I knelt there, Milo's warm, limp weight in my lap, feeling the shallow, rapid rise and fall of his chest. His big eyes were open, glossy, and fixed on nothing. I touched my ear, realizing my earring, a tiny diamond stud, was gone. The place where it used to be tingling slightly, a small detail I'd missed in the chaos. I had to move, had to find Lysander or a guard, but my hands were shaking too hard to lift Milo's bulk, and the dark hallway beyond my door felt like a sheer drop. The chemical smell on the rug, the open notebooks, the silent scream I'd swallowed, it all distilled down to this one tiny, helpless life. I pressed my face into Milo's fur, inhaling the scent of his coat mixed with that cloying, acrid smell of sedative, and a choked, desperate whimper finally escaped me. It was low, weak, and pathetic. I wasn't the defiant warrior I'd pretended to be in the last beat. I was the girl curled up in the corner, unable to save the one creature who loved me without question. My own shadow, cast long and grotesque by the minimal emergency lights down the hall, seemed to stretch, ripple, and suddenly grow dense, just before the faint, distant mechanical groan of the house's internal power finally, agonizingly, died completely. The mansion was silent, and the shadows were total. The sudden, total darkness was not the scariest part. The scariest part was the utter, complete silence that followed. It was the absence of the generator's growl, the failure of the final circuit that left me stranded. I lifted Milo's heavy body, clutching him tight against my chest, the cold marble floor striking me as I shoved myself to my feet. I didn't know which way was Alpha 6, where Lysander had been dragged, or which direction led to an exit. My brain was a white-hot mess of terror, but my body just moved, fueled by one thought: I have to get him to light. I burst out of the bedroom, nearly colliding with Ivana, who gasped and pressed herself against the wall, a hysterical whisper of "Go, go!" escaping her. I didn't spare her a glance. I didn't head for the silent main stairwell. Instead, I sprinted down the hall toward the sunken dining hall, remembering the huge arched windows there, shutters sealed, but hopefully offering a sliver of light from the outside emergency lamps. The dining hall was an echoing chasm of shadows. I skidded to a stop right where the plush carpet met the marble inlay. In the absolute quiet, the only sound was my own ragged, wet breath and Milo's weak, rattling exhale. I set him down gently near the center of the hall, near where a massive crystal centerpiece usually sat. My frantic eyes scanned the perimeter. The steel shutters were sealed, but the outer security lights managed to bleed a narrow, anxious strip of crimson light along the base of the windows. I lifted Milo toward that faint red line, turning his dull eyes toward the weak illumination. He didn't react, his limbs limp, but as I adjusted him, I felt a shudder run through his tiny body, followed by a soft, gurgling whimper of distress. He wasn't just sedated, he was collapsing. I knelt down, pressing my ear to his chest, and heard it, a heartbeat far too rapid, a frantic little drum solo against his ribs that was desperately trying to keep pace. I was holding the one life Lysander had gifted me, the one life that was utterly safe and uncomplicated, and it was failing. I looked up into the vast, dark expanse of the hall, the shadows mocking my helplessness, and the single, devastating realization hit me. Adrian wasn't just after the system. He was after everything I had let myself love. And now I was kneeling here, useless, watching it die. I smoothed Milo's head, the coldness of the marble seeping into my knees, trying to find a rhythm in his frantic, tiny breaths. I ran my hands over his pale gums, feeling the clammy heat coming off his small body. This wasn't some natural collapse or accident. This was the result of the forced, calculated chemical smell in my room. Adrian didn't want the data. He wanted me crippled. He knew how much Lysander cared for the dog, knew how much I cared, and he attacked the softest, most vulnerable part of our lives, the part we thought was outside the perimeter of the war. "Help," I whispered, the sound a dry, useless rasp. The massive hall swallowed the single word whole. I pressed my palm hard against the dog's ribcage, trying to anchor that fluttering heart, and a choked sob of pure helpless rage started to burn behind my eyes. I lifted my chin toward the black archway of the foyer, feeling the cold, silent disapproval of the empty mansion, sensing the invisible eyes watching from the walls. I hated that I had to ask, hated that I needed him, but Milo was fading. I pushed the shame down with the fury. "Lysander!" This time it wasn't a desperate cry for protection. It was a single, cutting command, sharper than any word I'd ever used, full of fury and the terror of losing something irreplaceable. The word echoed briefly, a lonely, defiant sound in the cavernous, deadly quiet. The command I'd issued was swallowed by the silence, and for one terrifying, drawn-out moment, I thought I was truly completely alone. But then a sharp, distant sound. The heavy iron door that sealed the west wing crashed open. Not a smooth swing, but a brute force impact. Then the sound of 2 feet hitting the marble running, fast and hard, closer than I could have hoped. Lysander burst into the dining hall, a silhouette against the sliver of red emergency light behind him. He wasn't composed. His hair was mussed, his shirt was pulled taut across his chest, and his eyes, when they finally found me huddled on the floor, were wide and unshielded for the first time I'd ever seen them. He saw me, saw Milo, and saw the absolute intimate danger in the way the small dog was trembling. He dropped to his knees beside us without a word. His hand, usually so steady, was shaking as it brushed my arm, a fleeting, almost touch that felt like a jolt of electricity through the frozen chaos. He didn't ask what happened. He just gathered Milo into his hands, carefully, reverently, like the dog was glass. Damn it, no. The raw sound of his voice, a low, pained grunt of denial, was worse than any scream. He pressed his knuckles to his mouth for a fractional second, his jaw working, forcing back the tidal wave of panic. Then he was all action, cold and hard. "Ivana!" he barked, his voice suddenly recovered, cutting through the dark. "Get every damn guard to the north gate now. I don't care what perimeter they set. And you," he looked at me, his eyes fierce and desperate, "get a blanket, something warm." He stood, Milo cradled against his shoulder, already moving toward the foyer. His terror was palpable, twisting the air around him, but it was anchored by an urgency that demanded my absolute obedience. He wasn't my protector right now. He was Milo's, and I was just the assistant, forced to watch him save the one living thing he truly let himself love. "Go." He didn't wait for my response. I didn't argue. His command sliced through my helplessness and gave me direction, something my brain couldn't manage on its own. I scrambled off the cold marble and ran back toward the bedroom, my feet pounding silently on the carpeted foyer floor, the sound muffled and strange. Lysander's shouting followed me, amplified by the high ceilings, echoing beyond the dining hall into the vast, dark house. He was ordering the evacuation of the guests, sending the few remaining staff into the chaos of the security breach. The sound of his voice, strained and urgent, was now mixed with distant sharp shouts from the lower levels and the frantic thunk-thunk-thunk of heavy objects being moved in the panicked rush. I ripped the heavy velvet throw from the foot of my bed. In the utter blackness of the suite, I could only feel the texture of the fabric, but that familiar, faint scent of Lysander's cologne that always clung to it was suddenly intoxicatingly safe. I spun to leave, stopping only when I registered a new sound. The high, electronic shriek of the central alarm, finally triggered by the chaos, immediately followed by the rhythmic, sharp clanging of the main security doors, sealing off the primary foyer entrance downstairs. This was no longer just an intrusion. This was a lockdown failure, a system collapse. The fear that had been focused on Milo's small, dying body suddenly ballooned to encompass the entire house. Someone was orchestrating the fear, ensuring not only that Lysander was preoccupied, but that the mansion itself became a death trap. I ran back toward the hall, the heavy blanket dragging behind me, the new, overwhelming noise a physical wave against my ears, and felt a cold, sharp certainty. Adrian is here. He's here, and he did this, and he won't stop until he gets me. I caught up to Lysander in the foyer, the silk throw clutched in my hand. His silhouette, broad shoulders, the tiny bundle of Milo in his arms, was the only focus in the deafening, frantic chaos. The alarm shrieking overhead, the crash of the door's ceiling, the distant panicked shouts, it was all a blur of noise. But I saw the deep, desperate furrow between Lysander's brows, the way his jaw was clenched so tightly a vein stood out in his neck. He was moving, fast and controlled, toward the armored elevator bank, but his face was pure, unadulterated terror. "Lysander?" I didn't shout this time. The noise was too great. I had to force the word out right next to his ear. It was deliberate. In my room, a chemical on the rug. They wanted him silenced. He didn't slow. He didn't look at me. But his eyes, glued to Milo's tiny, struggling face, shifted, focusing the pure panic into a deadly, concentrated fury. He glanced down at the velvet blanket in my hands and snatched it, tucking the throw around Milo with frantic, efficient movements. Then his gaze flicked up to mine, his eyes burning red in the reflection of the emergency lights. I saw the question in his gaze, a terrible realization. Did they hurt you too? I shook my head, my throat closing, unable to form a word. I reached out, my hand hovering near the shoulder carrying Milo, stopping just short of touching him. I didn't want to interfere with his life-saving focus, but I needed him to know. I knew who did this. I didn't say Adrian's name, but the silent, shared realization was enough. The air between us, charged with fear for Milo, momentarily dissolved the resentment and the tension from the last few days. We weren't lovers arguing about trust. We were two people who had just been brutally attacked, forced into a single, terrifying truth. The enemy was inside the gates, and they were willing to kill the innocent to get to us. The doors of the heavy steel elevator hissed open just as Milo let out a final, weak shiver that traveled through Lysander's body like an electric current. "Vet," Lysander ground out, his voice hoarse, pulling me inside the steel box. "Call the emergency vet, now." The armored elevator ride was a compressed, terrifying silence, broken only by the thin, rasping sound of Milo trying to breathe. My ears were still ringing from the house alarm, but when the steel doors opened onto the subterranean garage, I was hit with a new, sharper wave of sound. The idling roar of an unmarked black SUV and the urgent metallic scramble of guards. Lysander didn't wait. He moved instantly toward the vehicle, Milo still wrapped in the throw, a tight, still bundle of vulnerability against his chest. I fumbled for my phone, my hands slick with cold sweat as I tried to dial the emergency vet number he'd given me hours ago, back when this was just a hypothetical threat. Hypothetical. The word tasted like dust. I dropped the phone on the cold concrete. A guard immediately scooped it up and shoved it back into my hand. "Go with him, miss," the guard ordered, his face a grim mask in the low-hanging garage light. I stumbled forward, my bare feet hitting the rough asphalt near the car. Lysander was already in the back seat, the door open, his body angled over Milo, providing a shield against the world. I slid in beside him, pulling the door shut with a heavy thud that barely registered over the engine. He didn't look at me, his focus absolute, his jaw still tight with held-back panic. I could feel the heat radiating off him, tense and furious, a coiled spring of instinct. Milo was trembling again, the tremors visible even under the velvet throw. I reached for the dog, settling him into my lap, pressing my trembling fingers gently along his spine, trying to share my own erratic pulse with his failing one. "Hold him tight," Lysander finally grated, his voice low and ragged, his eyes darting between Milo and the dark, bulletproof window. "Don't let go." It wasn't a request for comfort or a lover's plea. It was a tactical order, a desperate instruction in a battle where the casualty was small and defenseless. And as the car lurched forward, speeding out into the night, I gripped the tiny dog, realizing that the love I felt right now wasn't soft. It was fierce, a weapon I had to wield to keep him alive. The air inside the car was thick, metallic with Lysander's cologne and the terrifying, faint scent of the toxin still clinging to Milo's fur. We were moving too fast, the SUV devouring the long, dark residential streets of the estate. Lysander hadn't touched me since the brief accidental brush in the dining hall, but the physical reality of the situation was drawing us together like magnets. His left knee was pressed flush against mine, and his right arm, rigid with tension, was stretched across the back of the seat, serving as a secondary perimeter to the car's armor plating. He was looking everywhere but at me, his gaze sweeping the trees and the few visible houses, his terror translated into vigilance. "Call them," he muttered, his voice still shredded from his previous shouting. "Tell them we're 5 minutes out, that it's a possible neurotoxin, needs immediate counteragent." I nodded, gripping the phone the guard had given back. My hands shook so badly that hitting the right numbers felt like trying to pick up grains of sand. I finally got through, the vet's answering service sharp and confused on the other end, forced to quickly absorb the reality of a billionaire bringing his dying dog to their emergency clinic in an armored motorcade. As I spoke, giving the instructions, Lysander shifted. His head dipped, his gaze meeting mine for a brutal, charged second before flicking back to Milo. That look, it was raw panic, yes, but beneath it was a stark, desperate need for reassurance, the kind he never allowed himself to show. Then his fingers found the edge of my thigh, just above the knee, the lightest possible pressure. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a connection, a desperate man anchoring himself to the last safe thing in his world. His thumb didn't move. It just rested there, a fixed point in the dizzying, dangerous speed of the car, and in that fleeting, terrifying intimacy, I knew. The enemy hadn't just attacked Milo. They had attacked us. Our vulnerability was now a shared weapon. My voice shook as I relayed the toxin symptoms, shallow breathing, rapid heart rate, limpness, to the woman on the line. I kept my gaze down, focused on Milo's small, still body, trying to ignore the dark, bulletproof glass next to me. The world outside was a smear of streetlight reflections and black trees rushing past, distorted and menacing. We were an island of panic, speeding through the deceptive peace of the night. I finished the call, placing the phone on the console, my attention immediately snagged by Lysander's reflection in the glass. He wasn't watching the road. He was watching the darkness, searching the blind spots between the security escort cars that bracketed our SUV. He was listening to the sudden, distant sound of sirens wailing in the far-off city. Not for us yet, but they were a reminder of the public chaos he was trying to keep us hidden from. My paranoia, already spiking since the mansion attack, went nuclear. If Adrian's people could disable the security and gas the safe room, the idea that they were incapable of tracking Lysander's most crucial, predictable move, rushing Milo to a private clinic, was absurd. Lysander's finger was still pressing into my leg, an unmoving, desperate point of contact, and I felt the tremor run through my own hand, which was gripping the dog so fiercely my knuckles ached. The outside world suddenly felt cold, hostile, and utterly transparent. I stared at the dark reflection of Lysander's profile, his features sharp with vigilance, and the absolute clarity of the situation settled on me like a physical weight. Adrian wasn't a hacker sitting miles away anymore. He was a predator, close enough to scent the fear, and every person Lysander had ever let past his armor was a target, a weakness for the enemy to exploit. I didn't whisper the thought. I just let the silent, brutal reality resonate between us in the compressed air of the car. This isn't just about Milo. This is about destroying every single choice you made to love. The engine noise was a dull, constant thrum, a deceptive sound of safety because the car was protected, but we weren't. My focus shifted from Milo's frail body to the man beside me. I could still feel the imprint of his finger on my thigh, a heavy, desperate mark of possession born not of desire, but of terror. I watched his reflection again, his eyes, always the darkest, most controlled part of him, flickering, reading the shadows. It was a moment of cold, terrible clarity, like the flash of a camera bulb. Adrian didn't attack Milo because the dog was important to Lysander. He attacked Milo because the dog was important to me, because Milo was a pure, simple conduit to the humanity Lysander had allowed to grow between us. I whispered the realization, the words barely audible over the hum of the tires on the wet asphalt, yet they felt like a gunshot in the confined space. If they can reach Milo, they can reach you. The observation wasn't meant to frighten him, but to warn him. Lysander stiffened, his head turning so fast the dark reflection in the window blurred. He looked at me then, truly at me, and the guarded, furious mask he'd rebuilt in the car vanished. All that was left was the raw, unadorned man terrified of being exposed. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to dismiss the danger. He just looked down at the dog in my lap, then back to my eyes, and his hand lifted from my leg, but only to curl possessively around the velvet throw I was clutching. His knuckles pressed against mine, a fierce, protective connection that said, "I know, and I'll kill anyone who tries." The unspoken threat was so powerful it felt like a silent declaration, transforming the fear for Milo into a desperate resolve to protect each other. The car slammed to a stop so abruptly, the seatbelt cut sharply across my collarbone, but I didn't flinch. Milo was already being gently lifted out of my arms by Lysander before the engine died, his movements swift, economical, and focused entirely on the small dog. We had arrived. The clinic entrance was a stark, sterile beacon of white light cutting into the black night. There was no cheerful sign or welcoming window, just a heavy, recessed door flanked by two more of Lysander's guards, already positioned and scanning the street. The air, even out here, was vibrating with the tension of the chase, the echo of the house alarm, and the distant, lingering wail of a real city ambulance far away, a soundtrack to chaos. Lysander didn't hesitate. He carried Milo inside, moving past the hushed reception area where staff in blue scrubs and face masks were already waiting. I followed, the cold concrete of the parking lot burning my bare feet, the contrast between the dark, dangerous outside and the coldly lit, urgent interior almost blinding. I felt the familiar, heavy thump-thump-thump of my heart against my ribs. It was the only rhythm I could trust. As the sterile white light fell over Milo's pale fur and Lysander's drawn face, the ultimate truth of the last 20 minutes hit me. Adrian had shown his hand. He wasn't after a business deal, a number on a ledger, or a file. He had targeted the only thing Lysander had ever allowed himself to cherish openly, knowing that by attacking Milo, he attacked the core, exposed, chosen vulnerability Lysander had allowed to grow in his life. My legs felt weak, the exhaustion finally crashing in, but I couldn't stop. I walked into the light, right behind Lysander, ready to witness whatever was next, knowing that every step I took forward was a step deeper into the war. What else would he attack to get to Lysander? I didn't realize I was rocking back and forth until the chair creaked a soft, rhythmic protest beneath me. The private clinic room, a sterile, silent cube, was dominated by the gentle hum of Milo's IV pump and the low, muffled voices of the nurses outside. I had Milo pulled tight against my chest, wrapped in the velvet throw from the car, his breathing now shallow but even. It was the only sound I truly cared about. I ran my hands slowly, repeatedly, over the short, soft fur on his head, feeling the fragile, rapid thump-thump of his heart against my palm. The memory of his collapsing body, the smell of the chemical on his collar, it kept flashing behind my eyelids like a strobe light. A minute ago, he was a vibrant part of my day. Now he was a reminder that the world was still cold, still out there, and still actively trying to ruin Lysander. And ruin me by extension. The relief that swept over me, now that the antitoxin was flowing through him, was so intense it felt like a dizzying physical weakness. I pressed my face into his fur, drawing in the scent of him, clean now and undamaged. I felt the familiar, old guilt rising up, sharp and acidic. I brought him here. I made him vulnerable. I risked him because I chose to stay. I whispered into his ear, a meaningless prayer that felt vital. "I can't believe you're still here." My knuckles were bone white where I gripped the throw, and in the silence of the room, the internal truth settled. If Milo's safe for now, if this small, helpless being can survive the malice of that man, maybe we can be too. Tentative, fragile, but present. The small warmth of the dog against my chest felt like the only solid, unmoving thing in a world trying to spin off its axis. I didn't realize Lysander was still in the room until the scent of his cologne, rich cedar and something sharply, cleanly metallic, drifted over the antiseptic air. I looked up. He hadn't moved far. He was standing near the doorway, leaning against the sterile white wall, his arms loosely crossed over his chest. The perfect, composed facade he usually wore was cracked around the edges. His hair was disheveled, falling slightly across his forehead, and there were faint, dark smudges beneath his eyes, the kind of weariness no amount of money could fix. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the IV drip bag, counting the descent of the clear fluid, his jaw working slowly. He was always in motion, always issuing orders, always dominating the space. To see him this still, this useless in a crisis he couldn't buy his way out of, was terrifying. My internal walls, which had shot up like steel during the last few hours, softened just a fraction. I saw him not as the powerful, untouchable billionaire, but as a man who had almost lost the one thing he allowed himself to love unconditionally. He lifted his hand to his neck, running a thumb and forefinger over the fine stubble beneath his ear, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of fidgeting I'd never seen him make. It was a visible sign that his iron control had momentarily deserted him. He was waiting. He was present. He was doing the one thing he rarely did, nothing. And in that profound, shared silence, I knew. He's scared too, even if he won't say it. His vulnerability wasn't spoken, but it filled the small clinic room, drawing us closer than any shouted declaration could. The silence was thick, but not empty. It was filled with the metallic hum, the soft brush of Milo's breathing, and the unspoken acknowledgement of the near disaster that had ripped the veneer off both of us. Lysander finally moved, pushing himself off the wall and taking 2 deliberate steps toward me. He didn't close the distance fully. He stopped just outside the circle of my protective reach, but closer than he had been all night. Our eyes locked across the small, sleeping dog. It wasn't a romantic look. It was a gaze of 2 people who had just crawled out of wreckage together, acknowledging the shared trauma. His dark eyes were intense, searching my face, not for weakness, but for stability. "He's stable," Lysander murmured, his voice low, sanded down to a rough texture I hadn't heard before. It was a statement of fact, a reassurance so carefully chosen it felt heavy. "The neurotoxin, it's reversing." I nodded, unable to speak, afraid any sound I made would shatter the fragile peace. I lifted my free hand, and without thinking, my fingers brushed lightly against his forearm, where the dark fabric of his jacket was stretched tight over muscle. The briefest contact, a spark of heat against my cold skin. It was an instinctive plea for comfort, a silent thank you for fighting for Milo. His entire body went still at my touch, his gaze dropping to where our skin met. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. He held the moment, letting the electricity stretch and thrum between us, until I felt compelled to break the silence. "We're okay," I whispered, turning his own words from the car back on him. "For now." My hand lingered for a breath longer than necessary. Even here, in the sterile glow of a crisis clinic, I want him, even though wanting him feels like inviting the next disaster. The desire for safety and the desire for him were now terrifyingly intertwined. The hours blurred, leaving a dull ache behind my eyes. I didn't want to go back to the safe room at the mansion, but standing here in the cold, antiseptic hallway outside the private suite felt like waiting for the next attack. It was 2 a.m., and the world was dead quiet, the only illumination the dim amber wash of the security lights on the polished floor. I sat on a low, padded bench, pulling my knees to my chest. Milo was safe, tucked back in his plush bed, a small victory bought by sheer, frantic speed. Lysander was across the hallway, leaning against the marble wall, doing a silent triage on his security protocols. He looked like an exhibit, beautiful, untouchable, and lethal. I watched the faint reflection of his face in the dark window glass, the strain visible even at a distance. I realized I was still gripping the edge of my borrowed throw blanket so tightly my fingertips were numb. It was the guilt, sharp and relentless, that finally forced the words out. "It's my fault," I whispered, the sound catching in my throat, hollow in the quiet corridor. "I should have left. I put myself in danger because I stayed." I didn't look at Lysander. I couldn't bear to see his confirmation. The silence that followed stretched thin, heavy with the weight of my confession. When I finally risked a glance, he hadn't moved. His gaze was fixed on me, intense and unblinking. It was the moment of complete, unvarnished truth, the breaking of the emotional dam. "I don't know if I can trust anyone," I admitted, the last word barely audible. Not Lysander, not Adrian, not even my own judgment. Just the terrifying, open chasm of fear of betrayal that lived inside me, fueled by every bad decision I'd ever made. Lysander didn't follow me immediately after my confession. He waited a beat, 2, maybe 3 full breaths, letting the echo of my fear, the word trust, sink into the quiet marble around us. He didn't scoff or dismiss the vulnerability, which was what I expected from the man who demanded silence and control. Instead, he pushed off the wall and moved slowly, not toward me, but toward the window. He looked out at the vast, wealthy, and dangerously dark grounds of the estate, his shoulders tense beneath the tailored jacket. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to strain to hear it over the rhythmic thrum of the central air system. It was stripped of all command, just raw sound. "I didn't leave anyone behind at the clinic," he said, the statement seemingly irrelevant, yet carrying a profound weight. He paused, turning his head slightly so I could see the sharp, unforgiving line of his profile. "Every time I have trusted completely, someone has used it as a lever, to hurt me or to take what was mine. That wasn't business, Sophia. That was family." He didn't offer details. He offered a hint of a deep, old wound, a betrayal that predated the hostile takeovers and the security bunkers. It was a secret he'd kept locked, but now, faced with the very real fallout of protecting the small dog, the lock had finally sprung. He looked back at me then, his dark eyes shadowed, his mask momentarily forgotten. "I know what it feels like when the person you trust most makes you pay for it." His admission hung there, heavy with implication. He took a hesitant half-step closer, his gaze softening, the corner of his mouth turning down in a gesture of empathy that pierced my fear. "I'm trying to make that easier." He didn't promise trust would be easy or safe, but he promised to meet me on the high wire. He took the few extra steps toward me, not to sit, but to stand directly in front of my bench. It felt less like a conversation and more like a high-stakes negotiation of space with Milo, the reason for all of this, as the silent witness in his bed nearby. His movement drew the lingering scent of his cologne closer, a suffocating intimacy in the silent hallway. He didn't touch me, but the sheer proximity was a physical pressure, heavy and intoxicating. I could see the tiny muscle jump in his cheek, the only outward sign of the effort it took him to hold his composure after revealing such a deep, family-rooted trauma. "Making it easier. What does that look like?" I asked, my voice barely a rustle of sound. I wasn't challenging him. I was asking for the blueprint for our survival. Lysander lowered himself slightly, leaning his forearms on his knees, bringing his face level with mine. The amber security light hit the sharp angles of his face, making his eyes look impossibly dark and intense. Our knees were inches apart. He reached out, not for me, but to stroke the velvet blanket covering Milo. His fingers lingered for a second on the edge, before sliding deliberately onto my hand, which was gripping the material. It wasn't a comforting squeeze. It was a slow, deliberate anchoring touch, his thumb tracing the bone beneath my wrist. The small contact was an electric shock, immediately overriding the cold fear of the night with a terrifying new heat. I wanted to pull away, fearing the risk of needing him, but I couldn't. I leaned in, a fraction of an inch, my own desire pushing back against the instinct for self-preservation. Our breath mingled. His eyes dropped to my mouth. This was it, the break in the dam, the moment of physical release that had been building since the car. But before the millimeters closed, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible shift of fabric far down the hall. A guard? Or something else? Lysander's head lifted instantly, the raw heat in his eyes replaced by cold, hard vigilance. He froze, The energy between us snapped like a high-tension wire. He didn't move away, but the moment was gone, replaced by the immediate, awful knowledge that even in this private 2 a.m. darkness, we were not alone. Even now, even with everything. I can't stop needing him, I thought, the realization hitting with the sting of salt. And that need, I knew, was a liability Adrian was waiting to exploit. The lingering tension from the near kiss in the hallway, the electric buzz of his skin against mine, didn't dissipate. It just morphed into a tight, anxious alertness as we walked back to the mansion. The clinic had been cold and sterile. The mansion was vast, echoing, and too richly shadowed. We weren't using the main stairs, preferring the narrow servants' corridors at this hour. Every single one of my senses was hyper-attuned to the silence. My own footsteps, muffled by the expensive runner, still seemed deafening. Milo trotted beside me, his ears twitching, occasionally casting nervous glances into the gloom. He was healing, but the trauma was etched in his hesitant gait. A distant door clicked softly shut somewhere far down the north wing. It wasn't loud, but in the oppressive quiet, it sounded like a hammer blow. I flinched, pulling my knees higher with each step, the skin on my neck prickling. It could be staph, but after the poisoning, every benign sound felt like an orchestration. Then came the second sound, a faint metallic clink, like a tool being dropped on marble, or perhaps the hinge of a camera mount being adjusted. It was too fleeting to pinpoint, but it originated from a darkened alcove just ahead of us. I stopped dead, my hand instinctively pressing against my chest, feeling the ragged beat beneath my borrowed thin nightshirt. Lysander stopped too, instantly, his head tilting toward the alcove. He didn't speak, but his presence, hard, centered, and radiating cold fury, was louder than any shout. The danger was no longer just a hypothetical risk from Adrian. It was here, in the silence of the hallway, breathing the same too-stale air. Something isn't right. Someone's here, watching. The luxurious walls of the mansion no longer felt like a shelter, but the velvet lining of a beautifully constructed trap. We didn't speak. The silence was the only thing capable of holding the high-voltage tension. Lysander gently placed a hand on the small of my back, not to push, but to guide me silently around the shadowy alcove. The heat of his palm through the thin fabric of my shirt felt both like a warning and an irresistible invitation. As we navigated the next turn, I caught it. The faint, almost invisible red pinprick of light on the wall where the corridor met the next wing. It was a surveillance camera, tucked into a decorative molding. I'd seen it 100 times, but this time the angle felt wrong. It was tilted lower than usual, focused not on the main thoroughfare, but directly down the narrower, personal path we were taking. It was following us. I flinched back, a sharp, cold breath escaping my lips. Lysander's grip tightened immediately, a possessive, protective anchor that drew me fractionally closer to the expensive, scratchy wool of his jacket. "What is it?" he murmured, his voice too close to my ear, the sound barely disturbing the air. I didn't answer with words. I only looked up and gestured with my chin toward the pinprick of light. The flicker of acknowledgement, a cold, ruthless awareness, darkened his eyes before he looked away. Just then Milo, who had been sniffing nervously at the baseboard, let out a deep, low growl. It wasn't playful. It was a guttural warning, directed at a closed service door 50 feet ahead. As if in response to the sound, that door, heavy, solid oak, creaked open a quarter of an inch, revealing nothing but blackness. Then, slowly, silently, it eased shut again. No one emerged. No one spoke. It was a clear, deliberate message. "We see you." Lysander didn't hesitate. He took my elbow, the touch now firm, steering me away from the area, his entire focus narrowed to the task of extraction. I can feel him wanting to keep me safe, and I can't fight how that makes me feel. It was a dangerous, potent mix of fear and sheer raw tenderness, and it was tightening the unbreakable knot between us. The silence was broken, not by another suspicious sound, but by the clean, sharp scent of expensive floral perfume. We had made it past the shadowy service corridors and emerged into the main gallery hallway, brightly lit and designed for display. Ivana, she was positioned perfectly, leaning against a pedestal displaying a Roman bust, as if she'd been admiring the antiquity for hours. Her posture was elegant, her expression one of polite, brittle concern, a mask I knew intimately. Lysander's hand dropped instantly from my elbow, pulling back into his usual fortress of guarded composure. "Lysander? Sophia?" Her voice was a smooth, chilling bell chime. "I was just thinking about you. We've had such an exhausting night, haven't we? So much drama." The word drama was delivered with a mocking curl of her lip, aimed directly at me. I gripped the velvet throw tighter, resisting the urge to snap back. I knew what she was doing, capitalizing on my exhaustion and the guilt that was still a knot in my stomach. She didn't have to mention Milo or the attack. The subtext of her presence in the hallway at this hour was toxic enough. "I asked the staff to prepare some herbal tea for you both," she continued, her eyes sweeping over my slightly disheveled appearance. "But I told them not to worry about Sophia's room just yet. After all, you two might need to consult through the night." Her eyes met mine, a flash of cold, triumphant malice, implying far more than a consultation, and reminding me that in her eyes, I was merely the illicit temporary problem. A raw surge of frustration mixed with fear twisted inside me. She was a master of using the social stage as a weapon. Lysander stepped slightly forward, subtly placing his body between her and me, his posture an unspoken barrier. He didn't look at me, but I felt the heat of his protection. Even with her here, even with this danger, I want him closer. The truth was terrifying. The more isolated the threat made us, the more I depended on the fortress standing in front of me. Lysander didn't spare a glance back at Ivana. He simply took my arm, the gesture economical and immediate, a clear end to the exchange. But instead of releasing me once we were past her, he kept his grip tight, tucking me close to his side as we moved toward a private study at the far end of the gallery. This wasn't just guidance, it was a shield. When he opened the study door, he used his entire body to block my path until he was certain the room was clear. Then, as I stepped inside, the subtle brush of his arm against my side was far from accidental. It was contact, driven by an urgent, protective instinct that tightened the air between us. He released me just long enough to seal the door behind us, the expensive polished brass lock clicking shut with an air of finality. He turned, leaning back against the door, closing off the world. The room was dark, lit only by the faint, filtered moonlight coming through the heavy curtains. "They're watching, aren't they?" I didn't need to ask. I needed to hear him confirm the paranoia. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice rough. He didn't elaborate, but the single word was enough. It meant the metallic clink, the repositioned camera, and the creaking door were all coordinated. It meant Ivana was part of the theater. He pushed off the door, taking one deliberate step into the room, closing the distance until the shadows were all that separated us. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a loud, panicked drum. Fear demanded I keep a wall between us. But the protective force of his presence, the knowledge that we were facing this together, tore the defenses down. I lifted my hand, hesitantly, toward the dark, clean plane of his shirt front. He didn't move to meet the touch, but he didn't retreat either. He just stood there waiting, his eyes burning in the dim light. In the safety of the locked room, separated from the eyes and the threats, the attraction was overwhelming. It wasn't just desire. It was the intoxicating urge to seek shelter in the very danger I craved. Even here, even now, I can't stop needing him. The need for safety, the need for his body, and the need for the vulnerable man he'd shown me were all the same, terrifying thing. The quiet of the locked study didn't last. It was 6 a.m., the faint moonlight replaced by a cold, gray dawn, and Lysander had left me only after ensuring the room was a sealed vault. But you can't seal off a billionaire's mansion from the demands of his empire. The door had to unlock eventually. The first crack in our shared fortress wasn't a physical breach. It was digital. I was sitting at a massive mahogany desk, scrolling aimlessly through news headlines when a private chat window popped up on the office terminal, accidentally left logged in by Lysander. It was from Julian, his head of security, confirmed the source of the recent data stream anomalies. Trace points back to a burner used outside the city, but the traffic routing is a nightmare. Adrian is using a classic shell network designed to look like a client portfolio review. Very clean, very strategic. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The paranoia from the hallway was real. Adrian wasn't just lurking. He was actively operating, weaving the mansion into his network of attacks. But the next line was the one that made me freeze, my breath catching high in my throat. "Also, sir." I pulled the surveillance logs from the hallway near the West Wing yesterday afternoon. Her meeting was short, very contained. Only one bag exchanged, a briefcase. Looked like a standard handoff. Hard to tell what was inside. She was very good about keeping her back to the primary camera. Should I flag it for analysis? Her meeting? I reread the line 3 times, the words blurring on the screen. A briefcase. Handoff. The chat didn't name the her, but the context, the West Wing, the need for surveillance logs, the subtle caution, screamed Ivana. The seeds of doubt had been planted immediately after the Milo incident, but Lysander had been too focused on the immediate threat to fully analyze the rest of the security footage. I heard the quiet snick of the lock turning. Lysander walked in, carrying 2 mugs of black coffee, his eyes still holding the residue of exhaustion and the tenderness from the night before. He saw me leaning over the desk, saw the glow of the screen, and the shift in his gaze was immediate and brutal. He didn't see me looking at Ivana's potential betrayal. He only saw me hunched over his secure screen, looking at private security data. The suspicion in his face was colder than the dawn. He didn't speak. He just set the mugs down, the ceramic clinking loudly against the desk, and looked at me as if I were a puzzle piece that suddenly didn't fit the picture anymore. I don't understand why he's looking at me like that. The memory of my own confession, I don't know if I can trust anyone, echoed back, a painful irony. Adrian hadn't needed to stage anything for me. He just needed to let Lysander walk in at the absolute wrong moment. He walked toward the desk, his movements slow and deliberate, the controlled stillness of a predator assessing a situation. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't even acknowledge the screen. The entire conversation was in his eyes, hard and flat, erasing the vulnerability he'd shown me only hours before. He saw me, a woman with a history of secrets, invading his most private, secure domain. I was checking for Milo updates, I said, my voice too defensive, too loud in the quiet room. I pushed the screen away with the heel of my palm, but the damage was already done. The chat log was visible. He leaned in, placing both hands flat on the desk, the polished wood reflecting the sharp angles of his face. He wasn't yelling, he was compressing air. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. My security network is a sealed environment, Sophia. It's not a general bulletin board. His voice was low, stripped of warmth. I have people for this. I know you do, I countered, standing up, putting my own body between him and the screen, desperate to protect the only piece of information I hadn't yet told him about the Ivana meeting, the one piece that looked like gossip, not evidence. But I was here, and I saw Julian's last message pop up. It looked like an urgent update on Adrian's attack network. He moved his head, just an inch, following my eyes, tracking my evasiveness. He didn't need to read the log. He knew the structure of the data, his lips pressed into a thin white line. My movements are coordinated with Julian's team, he stated, a chilling undercurrent of mistrust in his tone. Anything I need you to know, I will tell you myself. He paused, letting the implication land. Are you already gathering information independently? A raw surge of confusion and frustration hit me. He was reacting to the perceived breach of trust, not the actual danger, proving that his deepest wounds were still dictating his actions. You think I'm hiding something from you? The question was a challenge, sharp and immediate, hitting the core of his family betrayal trauma and my own history of deception. The soft, early morning light streaming weakly through the curtains did nothing to soften the brutal defensive tension that immediately spiked between us. The air in the study felt too thin, trapped by the closed door. I could see the battle happening behind Lysander's eyes, the genuine care and the absolute ruthless need for control fighting the old, deep-seated wound of betrayal. I think you're being secretive, he corrected, his posture shifting, pulling his weight back slightly from the desk. Which, given what we're dealing with, is functionally the same thing. Secretive about what? My voice rose, the defensiveness spiking into anger. He was attacking me for the exact vigilance I'd been forced to develop over years of surviving alone. I was checking on the threat that poisoned my dog and is actively watching us. I was doing the same thing you were doing 10 minutes ago when you locked that door. I took a step toward him, forcing him to hold his ground or back away. He didn't back away. You read the private logs, Sophia? His eyes tracked the tiny muscle twitching in my jaw. You accessed information outside of my explicit direction. Because I saw the part about Ivana. She's meeting people, exchanging bags, and you're worried about my loyalty? The moment I said Ivana, the tension snapped. It didn't break. It coiled, tighter. He moved, not in anger, but in a sudden, contained burst of energy, stepping around the desk and stopping impossibly close. The movement was so quick I staggered back half a step, hitting the edge of the mahogany desk. My hip bone struck the sharp corner. "That is my problem, not yours," he clipped out, his breath warm against my ear. The accidental proximity, the way his sleeve brushed the sensitive underside of my arm as he shifted, was paralyzing, a charged current running through the argument. We were fighting, yet the underlying desire was so hot it was distracting. He stared down at me, and I felt the truth of his protective instinct, the need to keep me away from his dangerous world, slam into the wall of his mistrust. His hand, instead of pushing me away, lifted, trembling slightly, stopping just inches from my cheek. "Tell me this," he grated out, the intensity of his confusion vibrating in the air between us. His voice was raw, pushed to its limit. "Why does wanting to protect you feel like pushing you away?" His confession hung in the air, a devastating piece of his carefully constructed wall crumbling. It was the deepest vulnerability he'd ever shown me, and it made the desire, already a raging current, completely unbearable. I saw the question in his eyes. He wasn't just asking about me. He was asking about the cost of loving anyone. He was asking if I was safe and if I was worth the risk. My own walls fractured. The anger dissolved into a fierce, almost desperate tenderness. I closed the final distance between us. The hand I had initially lifted defensively toward his chest now settled there, flat over the furious beat of his heart. It felt like standing right next to a nuclear reactor. Hot, powerful, dangerous. "I'm not the enemy, Lysander," I whispered, the words ragged. "The only reason I was looking at that screen was to find proof against the people who are trying to hurt you." I didn't mention Ivana again, letting the subtext of the conversation, the true external threat, bridge the gap of his mistrust. He stared at my lips, his chest rising rapidly beneath my palm. His hand, still suspended in the air between us, dropped sharply, closing over my wrist, not restraining, but holding. His thumb pressed against the frantic rhythm of my pulse point. He was going to kiss me. I could feel the infinitesimal controlled tremor in his body as he leaned in, his gaze fixed, heavy on my mouth. Just when it feels like we could. The intercom on the wall bleeped. It was sharp, loud, and utterly intrusive. Lysander froze, the shadow of his kiss a hair's breadth from my skin. His eyes snapped shut for a millisecond of raw frustration, then opened, instantly cold and professional. The tender, vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the fortress. "Sir," Julian's voice came through, clipped and urgent. "The satellite phone on the roof deck just received a transmission. Encrypted, one-time burn. It's from Adrian." Lysander didn't look at me. He simply released my wrist, the warmth leaving my skin as quickly as a thief. He turned and strode toward the study door, his entire focus ripped away. He was already gone, leaving me alone in the sudden silence, the air still humming with the residue of what had almost happened, and the knowledge that every moment of intimacy between us would always be shadowed by the life-or-death drama of the outside world. My hand was still warm from the frantic heat of Lysander's wrist, the phantom press of his thumb on my pulse point an agonizing memory. The study door clicked shut behind him, leaving me in the silence that felt louder than the intercom's shriek. I moved away from the desk, walking over to the window, pulling back a sliver of the heavy curtain. The early morning was cold, the air outside the glass dense and gray. The roof deck was directly above, and I imagined him up there, the encrypted message from Adrian burning a hole in his hands, pulling his focus completely away from me. I shouldn't have been relieved the kiss was interrupted. I should have been furious. But when I thought of him leaning in, of the terrible honesty in his eyes when he asked if protecting me meant pushing me away, a different kind of fear hit me, the fear of a soft place to land. I walked the perimeter of the room, restless. The moment demanded the truth. If our relationship, if this intense, chaotic bond, was going to survive the constant siege of his past and mine, we needed more than raw attraction. We needed an honest foundation, and I still hadn't given him the whole truth about the beginning, about the lie. When he returned, the urgency in his stride was gone, replaced by a cold, deadly composure that made the air feel like it had dropped 30 degrees. He didn't look at me as he crossed the room, pouring himself a fresh cup of the black coffee he'd left to chill on the desk. Adrian's message was simple, he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. He said he's sending me a present, something I misplaced. I watched him take a measured sip of coffee, the steam doing nothing to warm the glacial look in his eyes. He was already retreating, sealing himself back into the fortress I had almost dismantled. Lysander, I began, my voice quiet, forcing him to meet my gaze. I know this is a bad time, but we don't have good times. The last time we had a moment of connection, I told you I came here to ruin you. His eyes met mine, cold and challenging. He didn't deny it. He just waited. I need you to know why I'm still here, and why I haven't done it, I whispered, the words forcing their way past the lump in my throat. I sat on the edge of a leather armchair, leaning forward, making myself physically smaller, more vulnerable. I've never told anyone this, but with you, I feel I can. Adrian was my entry point. I came for the money I thought I deserved, and he was the one who gave me the idea of marrying you. The truth was a heavy stone I finally released. It landed with a dull thud in the quiet room. Lysander's hand, still holding the coffee mug, tensed, the knuckles turning white against the ceramic. The external threat of Adrian and the internal threat of my past had finally merged into one terrible, intimate confession. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, waiting for his judgment. The silence that followed my confession, Adrian was my entry point. I came for the money I thought I deserved, and he was the one who gave me the idea of marrying you, was worse than any explosion. Lysander didn't move. He didn't blink. The coffee mug in his hand might as well have been fused to his skin, his posture completely rigid. I watched the subtle, terrible violence behind his eyes as he processed the information, seeing how neatly my history slotted into his narrative of betrayal. He'd known I was hiding something, but to hear it tied directly to Adrian, to the idea of marriage as a calculated strike against him, that was the poison dagger. You're telling me this now, he finally said, his voice flat, dangerously devoid of inflection, after I just walked in on you attempting to access my security matrix, after I admitted to you that I feel like I'm fighting myself to keep you safe. Yes, I breathed, the word a confession in itself, because I can't let you keep putting your life at risk for a ghost of a lie. I need you to understand that while that was the start, it's not where I am now. I stood slowly, not wanting the visual barrier of the armchair between us anymore. My bare foot slid across the Persian rug, and I moved closer, invading the hard, frozen orbit he had created around himself. He set the mug down on the mahogany desk. The motion was unnervingly deliberate, silent, almost a performance of control. Then he lifted his hand, not toward my face this time, but toward the thin nightshirt I was still wearing, the borrowed shirt from the mansion's staff, and gently pushed the fabric aside. He was focused on the corner of the desk I had hit moments before, where a livid, purple bruise was already forming on my hip. His fingers, cool and calloused, brushed the edge of the injury, and I sucked in a sharp, quiet breath. It was a purely physical touch, assessing damage, yet it felt more intimate, more breaking than any kiss would have been. He didn't look at the bruise. He looked at the floor, then back at my eyes. What changed, Sophia? His voice was a guttural plea, trapped in a businessman's demand. Why the change of allegiance? Is this just another strategy? Are you protecting me, or are you protecting your access? I leaned in, driven by the intense need to close the emotional wound he was exposing. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by the simple, undeniable fact of my body reacting to his presence, even when he was punishing me with his suspicion. Every time I touch him, I feel the danger, and I don't care. I raised my hand again, my fingers just grazing the dark wool of his suit jacket sleeve. The contact was so slight it was almost accidental, yet the charge was immediate, running up my arm and straight into the core of my longing. He didn't pull away. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the conflict, the physical desire warring with the confirmed doubt. My fingers were still brushing his sleeve, a silent plea for him to let me in, but he kept his gaze on the bruise, using the physical injury as a shield against the deeper emotional one I'd just inflicted. He was so close, I could smell the faint leather of his suit, and the dark roast of the coffee on his breath. Access, he repeated, finally lifting his eyes to meet mine. The word was a knife, twisting the knife I'd already given him. That's what you've always wanted. Financial access, emotional access, control over the narrative. I wanted control over my life, I countered, my own voice shaking slightly, the injustice of his judgment feeling sharp. I wanted the power back that was stolen from me a long time ago, and I thought your money was the only way to get it. I leaned in further, ignoring the voice screaming caution in my head. I let my palm flatten fully against his chest, right over the racing heart that was contradicting his cold words. The contact was deliberate now, a challenge. I needed him to acknowledge the shift that had happened, the way the goal had changed from taking his money to saving his life and his heart. He exhaled slowly, a soft, broken sound that carried the weight of his exhaustion and his trauma. His hand moved from my wrist to my elbow, pulling me in the final, agonizing inch. Our bodies were barely touching, separated only by the thin cotton of my shirt and the expensive wool of his suit, but the air between us crackled, hot and volatile. And now, he whispered, his eyes dark, consuming. He was seeking the answer not in my words, but in the heat between our bodies. I swallowed, tasting the fear, pushing it back with the desperate, reckless courage only genuine feeling can give you. Now, I managed, my gaze locked fiercely on his. I look at you, and I see how much you've lost, how much this life has cost you. He lowered his head. The distance narrowed until I felt the whisper of his hair against my temple. His breath hitched, a silent admission, a break in his composure. His eyes fluttered shut, and in that second of absolute blind vulnerability, he released the pressure he'd been holding, drawing me in. This was it. The moment we risked everything. Then a sound cut through the charged silence, the unmistakable low thrum of the elevator, far down the hall, followed by 2 sets of quick, urgent footsteps echoing on the marble floor outside the study. Lysander's head snapped up. His eyes, seconds ago filled with a drowning depth of desire, hardened instantly, shifting to the distant threat. He held me still for one last, painful moment, his hand tightening almost painfully on my arm, before pushing me away, spinning on his heel toward the door. The moment was gone, burned away by the sounds of the mansion waking up to Adrian's latest present. Being close to you feels like stepping off a cliff, and I don't want to fall alone. I thought the words, but they were lost as he reached the security panel, his back now a wide, impenetrable wall. The connection was undeniable, but the world was fighting us, demanding survival over surrender. I stood motionless by the desk, the lingering heat from Lysander's brief touch on my arm searing through the cotton of my nightshirt. I watched his rigid back as he opened the door, disappearing into the hallway commotion without a backward glance. He had been so close to breaking, so close to accepting the devastating truth of my starting line and the current reality of my feelings, only to be yanked back by the constant, cruel presence of Adrian. The study, once an intimate, dangerous bubble, now felt vast and empty. The mahogany desk where he had put his hands, the leather chair where I had made my confession, they were just furniture again, incapable of holding the monumental feelings that had just transpired. My hand drifted to my bruised hip, then to my chest, over the frantic rhythm his closeness had evoked. I hadn't answered his question. What changed? The change was standing right there, feeling the terrifying, sharp edge of wanting someone more than you wanted your own survival. A heavy silence descended after the footsteps receded. The entire mansion seemed to hold its breath. I walked back to the window, pulling the curtain aside again, focusing on the cold light of the new day. He was up on the roof deck, dealing with the present Adrian had sent, and I was stuck here, having just handed him the perfect weapon to use against me. My original intention. My internal walls, so recently cracked by his proximity, began to rebuild, but they were softer now, lined with a crushing sense of inevitability. We were trapped in a narrative of tension and near misses. We couldn't trust, yet we couldn't stay apart. We couldn't surrender to each other, because the threat would just use that intimacy against us. I picked up the black ceramic mug he had set down. It was still warm to the touch. I pressed it against my cheek, inhaling the sterile scent of dark coffee and rich wool that still clung to the air. The desire was an anchor, dragging me deeper into the risk. I want him, even if it could destroy us. I put the mug down. The footsteps were coming back. Not Lysander's measured stride, but Julian's, brisk and serious. The door opened again, and this time the tension wasn't romantic. It was purely dangerous. Julian looked past me to the secure computer Lysander had just been using, and his jaw was tight. Whatever Adrian had sent, it was bad, and my moment of vulnerability was about to be swallowed by the urgent reality of survival. The click of the study door as Julian opened it wasn't loud, but it sounded like a guillotine blade dropping. I stood frozen by the desk, the lingering warmth of the coffee mug still on my cheek, the last vestige of the intimate storm with Lysander. Julian didn't look at me. His eyes were scanning the office, sharp and trained, settling immediately on the secured terminal. "Sophia," he acknowledged, his voice neutral, but his jaw was still a tight, hard line. The shift from romantic tension to pure, high-stakes danger was instantaneous and absolute. "Lysander is on the roof with the satellite," I said, my voice shaky but controlled. "What did Adrian send?" Julian approached the terminal. He didn't ask me to move. He just opened the secured messenger app, and a single, encrypted file appeared in the log. He typed a quick command to decrypt it, and the room was instantly filled with the pale, clinical glare of a document. It was a single, typed page. A present. Something I misplaced. Lysander's flat report of Adrian's message echoed in my head. The document wasn't financial or security related. It was a transcript, a highly detailed, word-for-word account of a phone conversation. My eyes snagged on the date, 3 years ago, then on the first paragraph. I didn't need to read the names to know who the speakers were. One was Adrian. The other, an unfamiliar burner number, was undeniably me. "Adrian, are you ready to confirm the target?" "Me, yes." "Lysander Thorne, I need the payout within 6 months of the wedding, enough to disappear." I stumbled back a step, the Persian rug muffling the sound. This wasn't just proof of my original intention. It was a devastatingly fresh transcript, retrieved and presented now in perfect synchronization with my confession. Adrian wasn't just attacking Lysander's company. He was attacking his core wound of betrayal, using me as the bomb. The vulnerability I'd exposed moments ago had been immediately weaponized. Julian, his face unreadable, leaned closer to the terminal, scrolling down slowly. He stopped at a sentence that made my stomach drop into a vacuum. "Me. He's getting harder to read. The paranoia is setting in. I just need him to trust me long enough to get the access key. Something doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it." The whole room, the whole mansion, felt like a cage closing in. I had made my confession moments ago, choosing love over my original, terrible plan. Now Julian, and soon Lysander, had a timestamped document proving my intent was calculating and ruthless, completely undermining the fragile truth I'd just offered. A low, resonant thunk sounded from the wall. The secure safe behind the portrait of Lysander's mother opening. Lysander stood framed in the doorway, his skin pulled taut over the sharp angles of his face. He wasn't looking at Julian or the terminal. He was looking at the small antique locket he held in his palm, something Julian must have retrieved from the safe for him. It was silver, intricately detailed, and completely out of place against the black tailoring of his suit. He held it out, not to me, but to Julian. "Julian, check the encryption key on this. It was my mother's. I misplaced it a week ago." His voice was a flat sheet of ice. Julian turned from the terminal, glanced at the locket, then back at the screen, the cold, damning transcript glowing between them. Lysander didn't acknowledge the screen, but the slight microscopic shake in his hand as he held the locket told me he was entirely aware of the context. His gaze finally shifted to me, standing pale and breathless by the desk, and in his eyes there was no confusion, no anger, just the profound, terrible realization. I thought I knew her, but maybe I was wrong. Julian didn't hesitate. He took the antique silver locket from Lysander's hand, his fingers barely brushing his employer's. The whole exchange was practiced, silent, a language of duty that left me completely outside the secure fortress. I stood there, a few feet from the desk, watching Lysander's face harden. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The transcript, glowing an awful blue on the screen, spoke volumes I couldn't undo, even with the truth I'd offered moments before. It was Adrian's ultimate proof, perfectly timed. Julian worked quickly, accessing the code on the locket. It's a standard key, sir. Nothing compromised. Lysander didn't answer Julian. He was staring at me, and his eyes were terrifying, not because they held rage, but because they held nothing. The vulnerability, the desire, the pain from the near kiss, all wiped clean. I was looking at the billionaire titan, the man who had built his empire by cutting out emotion. That transcript, Julian. Get me an authenticated IP trace immediately. I want the burner location, the provider, everything. Lysander's voice was low, stripped of any warmth. He finally acknowledged the screen, but only through command. Julian nodded, focusing on the work. This left Lysander and me alone in a new, toxic silence. He took a single, controlled step toward me. "The key," he said, his gaze locking on my bare arm, then sweeping up to my face. He said he was sending me a present, something I misplaced. Did you, by any chance, see this locket before I asked Julian to retrieve it from the safe? He was asking if I was already searching his safe. He was testing the waters, layering the suspicion. His trauma was driving the questions, but the transcript gave them teeth. "No," I replied instantly, forcing every muscle in my body to remain still. "I was sitting here when you came back. I haven't moved from this room since you left." My voice was too defensive, too loud, too fast. I watched his already tight lips thin further. The subtext screamed, "A good liar never over-explains." He looked at the desk where my hand had been resting. His eyes followed the line of my arm back to the faint, dark trace of the bruise on my hip. He remembered touching it. He remembered pulling me close. And he was using the knowledge of our intimacy, of the brief lapse in his own control, to fuel his distrust now. He took another step, invading the personal space I desperately needed. He wasn't reaching for me. He was simply existing, large and imposing, forcing me to feel the weight of his suspicion. His proximity, seconds ago a prelude to surrender, was now a calculated pressure tactic. "Adrian is meticulous, Sophia," he grated out, not asking a question, but stating a cold, unbending fact. "He doesn't send old information without a reason. He sent this now to make me doubt the honesty of your confession." The realization hit me that he knew the trap, yet was still falling into the emotional misinterpretation. He saw the logic of the manipulation, but his deep wound meant he couldn't choose to trust me over the evidence of the past. "Lysander," I pleaded, taking a small, terrified step back, bumping lightly into the chair. "Why are you choosing to believe the 3-year-old transcript over the raw truth I just gave you? Why are you choosing him?" His eyes didn't waver. "I don't know who to trust anymore." The words were delivered with the flat, dead finality of a funeral pronouncement. He wasn't referring to Adrian or Ivana. He was referring to me. The romantic bond was shattered, replaced by the bitter reality of his past. I flinched back from the devastating neutrality of his statement, "I don't know who to trust anymore." It wasn't an attack. It was a simple, hopeless assessment of his world, and I was now squarely in the threat column. "You know me," I insisted, the desperation burning my throat. "You know what we just shared. The real, ugly truth. Adrian is manufacturing this now because he knows I'm not playing his game anymore." I took a step forward, closing the distance he'd created, and the sudden shift in proximity was like flipping a switch. He inhaled sharply, his chest, still close enough to feel the heat radiating off his body, rising quickly under the wool of his suit. Julian, thank God, kept his eyes glued to the terminal, typing furiously to trace the source of the file. Lysander didn't back away this time. He just stood like a statue carved out of granite, letting the full force of my proximity hit him, absorbing the truth and the physical lie at the same time. "It doesn't matter what Adrian knows," he clipped out, his voice sharp with frustration. "It matters what I see. I see a transcript confirming you plan to use our marriage for access. I see you, moments ago, standing by the safe that holds the only key Adrian cares about." I was confessing the plan, not executing it. My voice was too loud for the small, tense room. "I was trying to tell you that the path Adrian forced me on is not the path I'm choosing now. Why can't you see I'm not the enemy?" The question hung in the air, weighted with everything we had both risked. The raw longing, the desperate need to prove my allegiance, slammed into the deep-seated fear of betrayal that ruled his life. He didn't answer with words. He reached out, his hand sweeping past my shoulder to slam against the wall behind me, inches from my head. The force of the impact jarred the heavy portrait of his mother, tilting it slightly, and a few dust motes danced in the light of the computer screen. He leaned in, his face shadowed, his dark eyes radiating a desperate fire. I pressed my back against the wall, my breathing hitched. The distance between our faces was microscopic, the charged air between us thick with unresolved desire and devastating fear. It was the near-kiss moment all over again, but soaked in fury instead of tenderness. "I need proof, Sophia," he murmured, the words hitting my mouth like a whip crack. "Not feelings. You deal in lies and secrets. I deal in consequences. And if I make the wrong choice now, if I choose emotion over logic, Adrian wins." He pulled back, just enough to break the suffocating intimacy, but his eyes never left mine. He was giving me an out, a chance to retreat, yet his stare was a desperate demand for me to stay and fight the evidence. I could feel the residual, frantic rhythm of his heart beneath my palm, the spot where I had touched him moments before. The only consequence he truly feared was the consequence of caring. I didn't move. "I'm not leaving," I said, the quiet assertion costing me everything. Lysander's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping violently in his temple. He looked ready to shout, ready to shatter the fragile silence, but he only gave a single hard nod toward Julian, the universal sign of dismissal. The confrontation was over, and the emotional wound was left wide open. The argument was over, not because anything was solved, but because Lysander had reached his internal limit. He took his hand off the wall, leaving the portrait of his mother slightly askew, and finally took a step back, breaking the dangerous, charged proximity. He didn't look at me, but toward Julian, who was silently closing the encryption file on the terminal. "Take the console to the secure sublevel, Julian. Trace this from a ghost server," Lysander ordered, his voice still low, but the flat chill was back. It was his operating voice, and it shut the intimacy down completely. Julian nodded, pulling a fiber optic cable from the back of the computer. Before he left, he shot me a long, complicated look, a mix of professional concern and personal warning. He saw the fire that had just occurred, and he knew it was a distraction. When the study door closed, the absence of Julian and the removal of the evidence left the room hollow and cold. I slowly pushed myself off the wall, my spine aching from the tension. I could still feel the phantom heat of Lysander's hand where it had been slammed inches from my ear, a symbol of his desperate need to push me away while simultaneously holding me captive. He was pouring himself another cup of coffee, the clink of the ceramic against the carafe ridiculously loud. He wasn't retreating physically. He was retreating emotionally, seeking the safe, dark control of his routines. I didn't move toward him. I just watched his back, the broad, taut line of his shoulders, telling me everything I needed to know about the emotional wall he was rebuilding. Adrian's attack had landed. It hadn't proven I was a threat, but it had successfully pushed Lysander back to his default setting: solitary, suspicious, and secure. The Darkwood study was becoming a crypt again, trapping the fresh, beautiful feelings we'd risked in the last hour. I raised my hand, the one that had pressed against his racing heart, and rubbed the spot on my cheek where his breath had landed. The truth, that I loved him and would fight Adrian for him, felt like an unbearable weight now, a thing he actively refused to take. I looked down at my bare feet on the rug. The faint sound of the wind, rattling the leaded glass window of the study, was the only movement. I want him, but now there's a wall I don't know if I can break. The silence was the only answer. Lysander hadn't asked me to leave. He hadn't asked me to stay. He was simply waiting for me to make the decision that would save him from having to choose between his trust and his survival. But I'd already made my choice. I wasn't going anywhere, even if it meant being trapped on the wrong side of his doubt. The consequences of staying, now, felt heavier than the consequences of running. But I couldn't run. The desire was a physical bond he had just made absolutely impossible to act on, and the danger was still outside the walls. He was focused on the carafe, but he wasn't pouring the coffee. He was holding the glass handle with a grip tight enough to shatter it. We were two statues in the same small space, the air vibrating with the fallout of the argument. Adrian had hit his target perfectly, driving Lysander back behind the walls. I had just risked everything to climb. I couldn't endure the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet that follows exhaustion. It was the suffocating absence of oxygen before an explosion. It wasn't a lie, I finally said, my voice barely audible, forcing him to acknowledge my presence over the static of his own fear. It was the truth of the beginning, which I just told you. The transcript doesn't change what I feel or what I'm doing now. His head tilted, a subtle, predatory movement. He lifted the carafe, then deliberately set it back down without pouring, the tiny, sharp sound echoing the finality of his focus. "Feelings are liabilities," he murmured, his back still to me. "Especially yours. They're too volatile, too easy to manufacture, too late to the game." I walked toward the mahogany desk, stopping an arm's length away from him. The scent of his dark roast, leather, and the clean, cold wood was intoxicating, dragging me back to the raw, near-violent intimacy we just shared. The fear was acute, but the need to reach him, to tear through the fortress of logic he was building, was stronger. I raised my hand, moving it slowly, tentatively, until my fingertips hovered just above the black wool of his suit jacket, the same spot where I'd felt the frantic pulse of his heart moments earlier. It was the absolute maximum of almost touch tension, a silent question demanding an answer. He knew my hand was there. Every muscle in his body stiffened, a full-body flinch held motionless. I could see the battle in the rigid line of his spine, the way his jaw was working. He wanted to shake off the proximity, to turn and drive me out with words, but the proximity itself was the poison, holding him there. "What is the new game, Sophia?" he asked, not looking at me, the question a low, guttural challenge. "Is it to confess your original plan, knowing that I will protect you from the consequences, making you safe? Is that the new access you seek?" The accusation was savage. He wasn't questioning my intent to betray, he was questioning my intent to survive. It was the only language he trusted. "I want him," I thought fiercely, pressing my internal commitment into the space between my hand and his coat. "I want him, but can I trust him with my heart while danger lurks?" I let my hand drop without touching him. The silence was heavier than any spoken word. The external threat, Julian's work on the burner trace, was a distant, cold hum compared to the agonizing, intimate war raging right here. Lysander was winning by withdrawing, and I was losing by staying. The silence stretched, cold and deep, interrupted only by the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears. Lysander was still facing the desk, a sentinel guarding his newly erected wall. I was rooted to the floor, past having spent all my energy just to stay in the room. But my gaze kept drifting from him to the study door, the heavy oak panel Julian had closed. I wasn't waiting for Julian to return. I was listening for the sounds of the mansion itself, the vast, echoing space that felt increasingly less like a shelter and more like a beautifully constructed trap. The late hour meant the staff was gone, and the mansion's usual low hum of activity, the distant sounds of security checks, the faint vibration of HVAC, had vanished. Now there was just silence, and that silence felt synthetic. The ambient light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, usually a soft blue-gray glow reflecting the city, seemed dimmer, flatter. I stared at the leaded glass, tracking the complex patterns until my eyes registered something. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the hallway outside the study. It was just a flicker of shadow, too quick for a guard, too fluid for the wind. The kind of movement you register in your peripheral vision before your brain labels it as wrong. It was a visual cue of surveillance, of being watched, an echo of the anonymous threats that had plagued Lysander's life and mine. My breath hitched. The personal, agonizing fight with Lysander had consumed my focus, making me forget the far colder, more calculating danger still at large. Adrian hadn't just sent a transcript. He had made a move, and that move had guaranteed Lysander would be distracted, suspicious, and isolated from the one person actively choosing his side. Adrian and Ivana were still out there. They were still orchestrating events. A sudden, sharp memory flashed. Adrian's chilling certainty in my darkest moments, the way he could anticipate every weakness. He hadn't just played on Lysander's trauma, he'd set a stage. Every moment with him feels dangerous, and I can't stop. I shivered, the cold not coming from the window, but from the sudden, stark realization that our raw, messy, emotional confrontation was exactly what Adrian wanted. It kept us inward-focused, kept us vulnerable to whatever came next. I needed to tell Lysander what I saw, but his broad, closed back radiated an impenetrable rejection. If I spoke now, he would interpret it as another ploy for attention, another calculated attempt to gain access. My survival instinct screamed at me to maintain the quiet, but the truth was, we were still standing in the blast zone. I stared at the spot where the shadow had flickered, then back at Lysander. The guilt of my past intentions, the ones Adrian had just broadcast, collided violently with the raw longing for the man standing rigidly before me. He was still by the desk, his hands now flat on the dark wood, leaning into the surface as if bracing himself against a gale. He was physically present, a giant dark silhouette against the dim window light, but emotionally absent. His withdrawal was a rejection I felt deep in my lungs, constricting my ability to breathe normally. I wanted to bridge the gap, to stride across the 2 meters of rug separating us and force him to look at me, to feel the undeniable truth of my commitment. But that old, terrible knowledge, a good liar never over-explains, held me back, freezing the urge to touch. He wouldn't see tenderness. He would see manipulation, timed perfectly after the transcript. The silence of the large room was amplifying the noise of my internal debate. Reach out, Sophia. Prove you're not a threat. But reaching out risked another explosion like the one moments ago, pushing him further away, cementing his suspicion. Stepping back, though, meant accepting the cold isolation he had imposed. The whole mansion felt oppressive, mirroring the crushing weight of my confusion. The shadows weren't just outside. They pooled around the heavy furniture and draped across the Persian rug, making the space feel both cavernous and claustrophobic. I can't ignore him. Not when the danger was still active, still lingering in the hallway, still using our emotional pain as a smokescreen. The idea of leaving him alone now, when he was most vulnerable beneath his armor of suspicion, was unthinkable. I moved laterally, gliding away from the wall toward the corner of the desk, keeping my distance while still staying within his field of vision. It was a neutral action, neither aggressive nor submissive, but it was enough to draw his attention. His head turned finally, slowly, as if the movement was painful. His eyes found mine across the distance. They were dark, deep pools of exhaustion and suspicion, devoid of the familiar spark of desire that usually simmered beneath the surface. He wasn't seeing me, Sophia. He was seeing Ivana. He was seeing the next person waiting to cash out. He offered no invitation, no reprimand, just a strained, silent demand. Justify your presence. And in that heavy, demanding silence, the counter-thought struck with ice-cold clarity. But what if being close kills us both? Lysander hadn't moved. The only sign he was alive was the minuscule adjustment of his fingers where they rested on the desktop, a final, minute pressure that showed the internal control he was fighting to maintain. I was still near the corner of the desk, close enough to be a temptation, far enough to be manageable. His gaze held mine, flat, heavy, completely impenetrable. He wasn't giving me permission to stay, but I felt the deep, agonizing need to breach the gap. He was demanding logic, and I had nothing left but reckless, terrifying feeling. The transcript worked, I whispered, not as an accusation, but as a miserable statement of fact. My eyes scanned the periphery again, sweeping past the slightly tilted portrait, past the heavy door Julian had used. It didn't just tell you I was a threat 3 years ago. It made sure you see me as one now. His eyes narrowed fractionally. The observation had found a hairline crack in his composure. You're seeing the evidence, I pressed, keeping my voice low and steady, but you're ignoring the context. Adrian sent that to force you to choose distrust, because he knows that if you trust me, you can't be isolated. You won't be easy to hurt. He finally shifted, pushing off the desk and taking one deliberate, challenging step toward me. It wasn't a move of intimacy. It was a territorial assertion, a warning to retreat. Hurt is quantifiable, Sophia, he said, the shadow of his former voice, the one full of controlled tenderness, briefly haunting the cold tone. Emotion isn't. I stood my ground, my stomach twisting with both the fear of his rejection and the desperate yearning his proximity always sparked. This was the moment. The emotional barrier between us was solid, and the external danger was lurking right outside the study door. We were frozen in a perfect stalemate. Lysander refusing to let down his guard, me refusing to leave the field. And that, I realized with a shudder that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, was the most dangerous position of all. Adrian had won the battle of trust. leaving us paralyzed in the face of the imminent, real threat. If trust fractures now, what will Adrian's next move cost us? The question was a prayer and a curse, the cliffhanger not just of the night, but of our survival. The study door closed behind me, cutting off the last of the study's clinical light. Lysander and I had moved without discussion into the private corridor outside the secure sublevel entrance, simply sharing the urgent, silent need to leave the scene of the emotional wreckage. He walked ahead of me, his steps slow and measured, radiating the same flat chill he had cultivated after Ivana's betrayal. I watched his back. The custom-tailored suit looked heavier, more like armor than clothing. His shoulders were tense, pulled back into a rigid posture that didn't allow for vulnerability. He wasn't looking at me, wasn't acknowledging the charged, fragile space we occupied. It was the body language of a man trying to physically outrun a feeling. The cold distance was immediate. Moments ago, we'd been pressed together, breathing the same air, his hand slamming inches from my face. A violent, twisted form of intimacy. Now he was a silhouette 5 feet away, the emotional wall between us rebuilt thicker and higher than before. I felt the sudden crushing shift from hope, the brief, reckless hope of my confession, to subtle, sick unease. He had chosen the transcript. He had chosen the quantifiable evidence of my past self over the messy, terrifying reality of the woman who stayed. He's here, but not really. I focused on the deep line etched between his dark brows, the subtle clench of his jaw. The betrayal was consuming him, reducing the passionate man I'd glimpsed to the isolated titan. Can I reach him before it's too late? I knew Adrian's game now, and the first step was to separate us, not physically, but spiritually. Lysander was making that easy. The silence in the corridor was thick with things left unsaid, but the noise inside my head was a cacophony of fear and memory. Every slow step Lysander took was a hammer blow to the fragile, newly healed space between us. I remembered standing over Milo's unconscious body, realizing the true, brutal stakes of this world. Not just financial, but lethal. I remembered the cold panic when the threats against the mansion became tangible, physical attacks. Lysander had protected me, fiercely, ruthlessly. But protection didn't equate to trust.